Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a concept that I find super fascinating, and that's Cartesian dualism.
Ooh, yeah.
Have you spent much time thinking about this?
Quite a bit, actually. It's
It's
one of
sort of,
those ideas that just grabs you and doesn't let go.
I know exactly what you mean.
Hmm.
So for anyone who hasn't encountered it before, this idea comes from René Descartes, the 17th century philosopher, and it basically says that the mind and the body are two totally distinct things.
Two different substances entirely.
Right. And, at first glance, it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, we all have that feeling that our thoughts, our emotions,
Mm.
they're not the same as like our physical body.
Definitely. It's so intuitive. Like when you stub your toe, the pain you feel, it feels different from the actual physical impact?
Exactly. It's like there's this inner world of experience that's separate from the outer world of physical stuff.
Hmm.
So Descartes gave these two substances different names. The mind he called res cogitans.
The thinking thing.
Yeah, and it's not just thinking. It's all this stuff that goes on inside our heads. Our thoughts, feelings, imagination, even that sense of me-ness, that self-awareness.
And the key here is that Descartes believed this thinking thing wasn't made of any physical stuff at all. No atoms, no molecules, nothing you could see under a microscope.
Oh, okay. So then what about the body?
Well, the body he called res extensa, which basically means extended thing, all the physical stuff that takes up space.
So basically, our bodies are just machines running on the laws of physics, cause and effect.
Exactly. And here's where things start to get really interesting. Because if the mind is this non-physical thing and the body is this physical machine, how do they interact? How does my mind, which isn't made of anything, tell my body to move?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like when I decide to reach for my coffee cup, how does that thought, that non-physical intention, translate into my arm actually moving?
That's the million-dollar question. It's what philosophers call the interaction problem, and it's been a major sticking point for dualism ever since Descartes proposed it.
It's a tough one, for sure. So how did Descartes himself try to explain this interaction?
Well, he pointed to the pineal gland, a tiny gland in the brain.
Hold on. He thought this little gland was somehow responsible for connecting the mind and body.
It was the best he could come up with at the time. He knew very little about the brain, obviously, but he noticed that the pineal gland was one of the few structures that wasn't duplicated on both sides of the brain.
Ah, so he thought that made it special, like a potential point of connection.
Yeah, something like that. He was a bit vague on the actual mechanism, but you can see how he was struggling with this problem. How can something non-physical interact with something physical?
It definitely seems like a puzzle. But even if the how is a bit fuzzy, there's still something appealing about this mind-body separation, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it just feels right on some level, doesn't it? Like there's this part of us that's more than just our physical selves.
It's like that feeling that our thoughts and feelings are somehow deeper, more significant than just the physical stuff happening in our brains.
And it really makes you grapple with the mystery of consciousness? How do we explain that inner world of subjective experience? Dualism offers a way to think about that, to see consciousness as something distinct from the material world.
Yeah, it's definitely a thought-provoking idea, but I'm guessing it hasn't gone unchallenged, right?
Oh, definitely not. The interaction problem is a big one. And as science has advanced, especially our understanding of the brain, a lot of folks have pointed out some serious flaws in Descartes' thinking.
So what are some of the big challenges to dualism? Like what evidence makes people question this idea of a separate mind and body?
Well, one of the biggest comes from neuroscience. All the amazing discoveries we've made about how the brain works.
Yeah, we can actually see what's happening in the brain now,
Yeah.
like when we think or feel things.
Exactly. We can measure brain activity. We can see which areas light up when we do different tasks, when we experience different emotions. And it all points to this really strong connection between our mental states and what's physically happening in the brain.
So it's not just this mystical mind floating around somewhere. It's all tied to those neurons firing in our heads.
It seems that way, yeah. Like when you drink too much coffee, it's not just that your mind feels jittery. There are actual physical changes happening in your brain chemistry that are causing those feelings.
Okay, so that makes sense. But if the mind and brain are so connected, does that mean dualism is just wrong? Like, are there other ways to think about this relationship?
Well, some folks have proposed alternative theories, like monism, which says there's actually only one kind of stuff in the universe. It's not two separate things, mind and body. It's all one thing.
So everything is either physical or everything is mental. That's a pretty wild idea.
Yeah, it is. It gets pretty complex.
Yeah.
But it's one way to try to resolve this problem of how two fundamentally different things can interact.
I can see how that would simplify things. But are there any other theories out there?
Yeah, another one is emergentism, which is kind of like a middle ground. It says that mental states, like thoughts and feelings, are real, but they emerge from the complexity of the physical brain.
So it's not that the mind is separate. It's more like it arises from the brain. Kind of like how wetness emerges from a bunch of water molecules, even though the individual molecules aren't wet.
Exactly. It's a fascinating idea. And it kind of acknowledges both the physical basis of the mind and the unique qualities of consciousness.
Okay, so we've got dualism, monism, emergentism. It's like a philosophical buffet. But even with all these different theories, I still keep coming back to this feeling that consciousness is something special, something that goes beyond just the physical stuff.
I know what you mean. Even if we could map out every single neuron firing in the brain, would that really capture what it feels like to be you? To experience the world from your unique perspective?
It's like that old saying, you can't understand someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes. But in this case, it's like you can't understand someone until you've lived their life, experienced the world through their senses, their thoughts, their feelings.
Exactly. And that's why even though dualism has its problems, it raises these really deep questions about consciousness that we're still grappling with today.
Yeah, like we're still trying to figure out how to bridge that gap between the physical and the the objective and the
Well,
subjective.
it's a challenge, but it's also what makes this whole topic so fascinating. It's about understanding ourselves at the deepest level.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about philosophy, but how does all this connect to the real world? Like, does Cartesian dualism actually affect our lives today?
Oh, I think it does more than we realize. The idea that the mind and body are separate has really influenced how we think about a lot of things, from healthcare to technology.
Oh, interesting. Like how?
Well, for example, think about how we often treat physical health and mental health as two totally separate things. You go to a doctor for your body, a therapist for your mind. It's almost like they're dealing with two different machines.
Now that you mention it, that is how it's set up. It's like we've got a mechanic for our engine and a separate one for the electrical system, but they're all part of the same car.
Right. And while there are definitely valid reasons for specialized care, this separation can sometimes make us overlook the ways that our mental and physical well-being are deeply interconnected.
Yeah, like when you're stressed out, it's not just all in your head.
Yeah,
It can affect your sleep, your appetite,
yeah,
your immune system. It's all connected.
exactly. And that's something that I think dualism, with its emphasis on separation, might make us less likely to see.
That's a really interesting point. So it's like this old philosophical idea is actually shaping how we approach health and wellness in the 21st century.
It's a subtle influence,
Mhm.
but I think it's there. And you see the separation popping up in other areas too, like in technology, especially with all the talk about artificial intelligence.
Oh, how so?
Well, if consciousness is separate from the body, like dualism suggests, could we create conscious machines? Could a computer ever have feelings and experiences like we do?
Whoa. Now we're getting into some serious science fiction territory.
Mm.
But it's a fascinating question. If AI could become conscious, would we owe them the same respect and rights as humans?
That's a huge ethical question. And it all stems from this idea that the mind is something separate, something that could potentially exist outside of a biological body.
It's mind-blowing to think that a philosophical concept from centuries ago could have such profound implications for the future of technology.
I know, right? It just shows you how these big ideas about the mind and body continue to shape our world in ways we might not even realize.
Okay, so dualism might be flawed, but it's definitely given us a lot to think about. But before we wrap up, I'm curious about Descartes himself.
Yeah.
If you were alive today, how do you think you'd react to all these challenges and alternative theories?
Ooh, that's a great question. It's fun to imagine, isn't it?
I think he'd be blown away by all the things we've learned about the brain. Like imagine showing him a brain scan, seeing all those neurons firing in real time.
Oh, absolutely. He was so focused on the pineal gland, but now we know there's so much more going on in the brain.
Right, like entire networks of neurons all communicating with each other. It's mind-bogglingly complex.
I think he'd be fascinated, but also maybe a bit unsettled, because the more we learn about the brain, the more it seems like the mind is deeply intertwined with it. Not so separate, after all.
Yeah, it's like maybe he was onto something with this idea of the mind and body being connected, but he just didn't have the tools to understand how deep that connection really goes.
Exactly. It's like he gave us this puzzle, this framework for thinking about the mind and body. And now we're filling in the pieces with all these new discoveries.
So maybe if you were alive today, he'd be revising his theory, coming up with something new. Who knows?
He might even be a neuroscientist himself.
That's a fun thought. So for our listeners who are eager to keep exploring these ideas, where would you point them? What resources would you recommend?
Well, going straight to the source is always a good idea. Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy lays out his arguments in a really clear way.
It's amazing how readable it still is, considering it was written centuries ago.
It really is. And for folks who want to dive deeper into the modern debate around consciousness, David Chalmers' The Conscious Mind is a great place to start.
That one's definitely a brain bender,
Yeah.
but so worth it. And for listeners who are more into the science side of things,
The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge is fantastic. It's all about neuroplasticity, how the brain can actually rewire itself.
that one really challenges the idea of the mind being fixed and separate from the body.
It does. And, it's not just philosophy and science that grapple with these ideas.
Right. Art explores them too, like in movies, books, music.
Well, absolutely. Think of films like Inception or Her. They play with the nature of reality, consciousness, the boundaries between the mind and technology.
It's like art gives us these thought experiments, letting us explore different possibilities, different ways of understanding ourselves.
Exactly. And of course, there are some great podcasts out there too that delve into these topics.
Like The Minefield and On Being. We'll be sure to link to all these resources in the show notes.
Yep, lots of good stuff to check out.
But before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with a little something to chew on.
Intriguing. Lay it on me.
If you could ask Descartes just one question today, knowing everything we know now, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a tough one. But I think I'd ask him, how would you redefine the self? Knowing what we now know about the brain and the mind, would you still see them as separate? Or would you see them as two sides of the same coin?
That is such a good question. It would be fascinating to hear his answer, to see how his brilliant mind would grapple with all the evidence we have now.
I know, right? But ultimately, the question of who we are, how we understand ourselves, that's something each of us has to answer for ourselves.
So keep those minds engaged, folks.
Yeah.
Keep questioning, keep exploring.
That's what it's all about.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Cartesian dualism. It's been a real mind bender.
It has. Always a pleasure chatting with you.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.